Stephen next defines what a paradigm is and how changing our paradigms or the ways we see the world can result in major improvements in our personal and organizational lives.
I'd like to use a scientific term for a moment to describe what I'm presenting. It's called paradigm. A paradigm is the way you see the world, the way you see the universe. The way you see your role is a paradigm. For instance, a friend of mine just a couple of days ago had been up all night delivering babies, and I called in the morning to see if I could pick up his son to join with my son to go to a parade. And he was telling me about the night's activities. I said, "What's it like? You've delivered hundreds of them now. Do you ever find it becoming routine?" He said, "Stephen, you have no idea how moving, how inspiring an experience it is." I said, "What are you most impressed with?" He said, "If the father participated over time in preparing for the birth and was present during the last stages, it profoundly affects the way they think and feel." One of the deliveries this morning was a newborn of a father who was a macho football player. He, in all of our visits, was rather filled with himself, with his concerns, his time schedule, and his own world, his own way of thinking. He said, "This morning I saw him picking up the phone and calling his parents and unable to speak. He was so moved, so overwhelmed. A new family unit was being formed. His role was changing from one of husband to one of father. He sees things differently. He will never be the same again. He could slip back if he's not careful, but his paradigm, at least for this morning, I'm using my language now, has shifted. And that will produce a dramatic, revolutionary change in his behavior and attitudes." That's what a paradigm shift is. In science, you'll find that every significant breakthrough was a break with. It was a break out of old ways of thinking. Einsteinian physics eclipsed Newtonian physics. It's a relativity paradigm. Remember what a paradigm is again? It is the way you see the world. It's like a map of the territory. The relativity paradigm had higher predictive and explanatory value than the clockwork paradigm of Newton. We could get to the moon on Newton, but could not understand the basic unit in the universe called the atom. Einstein made a very significant statement, which has relevance for us now. He said, "The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them." Again, the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. In other words, the major problems cannot be approached with the thinking that created them. It requires a new level of thinking, a new paradigm. Take the field of medicine. Until the germ theory was developed, which was a better map of what was happening out there, a high percentage of the women would die in childbirth. They even preferred to be delivered by midwives because there was less childbirth deaths. No one could understand why. Men in the lines who were wounded in the army were dying more from the wounds, small wounds, than some of the major traumas on the front lines. As soon as the germ theory was developed by Semmelweis and others, a whole new paradigm, a new map, a better, improved way of understanding what was happening, made dramatic, significant improvement. A whole different way of thinking. Study yourself. Study the way you see the world. In the last analysis, your head creates your world. I'll explain that in greater depth a little later. Let me give to you a recent paradigm-shifting experience that I had, and I'd like you to share in this experience. I want you to work with your mind and empathize with this situation and see if you do not experience a paradigm shift, as did I. Now, I must give kind of the bottom line before I give you this experience. What I'm suggesting is, if you want to make small improvements in relationships, in organizations, in your families, your marriages, and in yourselves, then work on your behavior. Work on your attitudes. If you want to make major, significant, quantum-type improvements, change your paradigm. Change your way of thinking. Change your map. All right, now let me give you this experience and see if it does not happen to you as it did to me. It was a Sunday morning in New York. I was on a subway alone. It was a rather quiet morning. The subway was no more than perhaps a third filled. Very unlike, I'm sure, the raucous night before. People were just quietly sitting there, and some were reading their newspapers. It was kind of a pleasant, quiet morning. Now empathize, project your consciousness into this scene. All of a sudden, a man and his children, a large group of children, got onto the subway. And they were so loud and so noisy, so raucous, that instantly the whole climate had changed. The man sat right next to me and did nothing about this whole situation. Everybody was yelling back and forth, throwing things, even grabbing people's papers. I mean, it was very disturbing. The man next to me did nothing. You're sitting next to him, and you witness this, disturbing everybody. How irritating, how upsetting. So I turned to him after a few minutes and said, "Sir, your children are really disturbing a lot of people. I wonder if you couldn't control them a little more." And he was looking down, kind of lifted his gaze as if to come to a consciousness of the situation, and said, "Oh, I guess I should. We just came from the hospital, and their mother just died about an hour ago. And I guess I don't know what to think, and I guess they don't know how to handle it either." Now, do you see that situation differently? I did instantly, as you do. You have a different map. Notice how free-flowing and spontaneous your attitudes of helpfulness and sympathy are. Notice how your behavior flows from that. I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Your wife just passed away." He was almost beside himself. "What can I do to help?" See, I wanted to. Look how your attitude and your behavior are a function of your paradigm, of how you see the situation. Up to that point, I was forcing myself to give him this feedback in a fairly pleasant but direct way, when really inside I was getting increasingly upset that he would be so insensitive as to see his kids just running wild around there and him doing nothing about it, taking no responsibility at all. But the whole situation changed, as it does with you right now. You'd want to help him, and that involved doing some other things. But you'd want to. You could feel the sympathy and the plight, the misery of another human being with his family. And he was almost incapable of coping with such a major thing that had happened. You see, in a sense, the key to our circumstances and our lives is to think about the lens of our glasses, our paradigms, our maps that we're looking through, and to perhaps change our paradigm, our role, to reframe the whole situation so that you can interpret it in a new light. It isn't what happens to us that affects our behavior. It's our interpretation of what happens to us. And if we can learn to get a better map, a better paradigm, get at a different level of thinking, we are on the road to significant improvement. My friends, these 7 basic habits represent each one a paradigm shift from the traditional way of thinking, from the popular patterns in society. Each one of them. I think you'll discover that as we go through this presentation, and I will make it explicit near the end of the presentation in part 3 when we review what we have covered.